Welcome back, everyone. Before we discuss group by operations, we should understand aggregate functions in general. SQL provides a variety of aggregate functions, and PostgreSQL is no exception to that. And all the functions we see here are available in any major SQL engine. The main idea behind an aggregate function is to take multiple inputs and return a single output. Now, PostgreSQL provides many different types of aggregate functions, and you can check out the link in this slide in order to go to the official documentation page, but we're just going to discuss the most common aggregation functions in this particular lecture. The most common aggregate functions are average, which returns the average value or mean value. There's count, which we're actually already familiar with, it returns the number of values or rows returned. Then there's max and min, which return maximum and minimum respectively. And then there's sum, which returns the sum of all the values, so it adds everything up in that particular column. Keep in mind that aggregate function calls happen only in the select clause or the having clause. We don't know about the having clause quite yet, but we're going to learn about it later on in this section. Some special notes to keep in mind for certain particular aggregate functions is the average call returns a floating point value many decimal places long. So for example, it could be something like 2.342418, etc. And you can use the round function on top of average to specify precision after the decimal. So we'll see that in this particular lecture. And keep in mind that count simply returns the number of rows, which means by convention we could just use count asterisk in order to see the number of rows. We can either pass in a specific column or just an asterisk since it's essentially the same thing. But we've already discussed that before. Let's go ahead and see some examples of aggregate functions in our own database. I'm going to head over to pgadmin now. All right, let's begin by exploring the film table since we'll be using that. So we'll say select everything from film. And if we run this, we can see we have a film ID, title, description, and then release year, language ID, and we also have this replacement cost. Notice we have several values here. Let's imagine right off the bat, I wanted to know what the minimum replacement cost was. Well, what I could do is call my aggregate function, and then I'm going to call parentheses, since this is a function call, and I call it on that column, replacement cost. And when I run this, it's going to return back the minimum replacement cost. So at a minimum, we're going to have to spend $9.99 to replace a certain film. Now that also means certain films are more expensive. So maybe we have a budgeting question asking what's the most we can expect to pay to replace a film. In that case, we can just call max and figure out the maximum replacement cost. So the maximum replacement cost now reported back is $29.99. So that is the min and max function, pretty self-explanatory, and you can call them just on any column here. Keep in mind, if we were to try to call something else, like let's say I also wanted to call the film ID column for some reason, that doesn't really make sense. And the reason for that is we're just actually calling an aggregate function on a column, which means max replacement cost just returns a single value. So it doesn't really make sense to call another column with this. In order to call other columns, we'll have to learn about the group by statement, which is coming up next. So keep that in mind. When you're doing just simple calls or queries like this, where we want to figure out the min or max, it doesn't really make sense to call other columns there, since we're aggregating a bunch of values to just a single value. What you could do is something like min replacement cost from film, and we run this, and that works. And the reason this works is because that function, maximum, and this function, minimum, are both returning a singular value. So this will be the max and min for your replacement costs. So keep in mind, because those rows happen to match up, that sort of query makes sense. Okay, let's explore the other aggregate functions we talked about. We're already familiar with count, which is essentially just counting the number of rows returned. So we can say select count and asterisk, run that, and that returns back how many rows we have. So we have 1,000 films. And keep in mind, this works on any column. So we could also say film ID, and that's essentially the same thing. Since that's the case, by convention, we typically just write an asterisk there. And we're already familiar with count. Let's imagine we wanted to know the average replacement cost. What I could do is say average replacement cost, run that, and that's going to grab the mean or average from the film table. However, you probably noticed it looks a little strange here, and that's because by default, this average call gives you a lot of significant digits. So if we expand this column, notice how I'm stretching it out here, we can see that it's actually 19.984 and then a bunch of zeros. So realistically, you probably don't want all these significant digits past the decimal point. So what we can do is wrap this around with a round function, and the round function actually takes in two parameters. One is the value you actually want to round, and then we're going to put a comma here and how many decimal places we want to round it to. So we'll say to 2 decimal places. And this is essentially a mathematical call on this result. So it's going to take this result and then round it to just 2 places past the decimal. And then when I run this, notice I get back $19.98 as the average replacement cost from the film. And we can always edit this if for some reason we wanted 3 decimal places. We can run that and it keeps going. If I said 4, as you may have guessed, it'll start including the 0. So you can either stretch out this column to see all the results if you don't have that rounding call, or realistically, you're probably going to want to round this to some degree. Again, notice how round uses parentheses in order to organize its parameters or its inputs. Here we have the input that we're trying to round, and then the second parameter is how many decimal places. So we discussed average, count, max, and min, and then we finally have sum, which is going to sum all the values in a column. So what does that actually mean? If we take a look at our table again, select everything from film, let's imagine for some reason we had to replace every single film. So we were opening a duplicate store and had to replace every single film. So we needed to figure out the total sum of the replacement cost column. What we can do is say sum replacement cost. We run this, and it would cost us $19,984 to replace all those movies. And if we think about this value for a second, it actually makes perfect sense. Recall that when we were taking the average replacement cost, it was 19.984. And here, we're replacing 1,000 movies with the average replacement cost, so which means the sum of the replacement cost should equal the average times the actual amount of movies we have. So that's essentially 19.984 times 1,000 movies, which means, again, the total cost to replace all the films would be $19,984. All right, so those are the aggregate functions by themselves. That's average, count, max, min, and sum. You can hit the slides and check out the link for more complex aggregate functions, some of them which we will go over in later lectures. But right now, these are really the most common ones you should know right off the bat. And coming up next, we're going to see how we can use this in conjunction with group by to create very powerful queries. I'll see you at the next lecture.